Welcome, everyone. This is the 30 Days of Forgiveness, and I'm your host, Misty, with drmistyfunk.com. Today, I'm having a discussion with Radical Forgiveness Master Coach, Rose Tobin, and we're going to be delving into a topic that's really, really important, and that's using radical forgiveness in forgiving others. Rose, is there anything you want to share about yourself or about your background that might help put our listeners at ease to the really complex topic we're going over today?
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to say, Misty, how grateful I am for the opportunity to share about radical forgiveness with your listeners, because it is such a valuable process. And if it helps to put your listeners at ease, it wasn't something I found easy to do, forgiveness. I could in maybe sometimes, or I could do it in my head intellectually, but the feelings would sometimes still be there. You know, that feeling, you think you've forgiven something and then you get a knot in your stomach, or you see the person and your throat gags or whatever. Okay. So I intellectually I could understand it. I could probably speak about it, give a sermon about it, but it wasn't always easy to do. Okay. And that for me is the great value of radical forgiveness, because I came across it when I was going through a very difficult phase about 3 or 4 years ago in 2013. Something had happened in a group, and I think it happens in a lot of groups where everything starts out well and then something falls apart and people get turn against each other, and it can be very hurtful and very upsetting. And I'd gone through a situation like that, and I think in my mind I'd begun to understand what a lot of the lessons were for me. I was able to see maybe that some of the things I didn't like in other people, I had to kind of realize, gosh, I'm doing some of the same myself. Not easy to look at, but I didn't quite know how to what to do with that information. It was still in my mind, still in my head a little bit. I had the language for it, but I didn't know what to do. And quite often, and I'm sure you've found this in your life, when you're ready for something, it seems to happen. You come across it, a book drops into your lap, or you hear something. And I happened to download an audiobook of this book. Tell me if it's coming up in the camera. Is
Yes.
it Radical Forgiveness by Colin Tipping? He's an Englishman. And he was reading the book himself, which was a bonus. And within about half an hour of listening to Colin reading his book, I knew that this was something I wanted to follow up on. I could feel the truth in what he was saying. And actually, within a week, I had actually enrolled as a coach.
Oh,
And
wow.
one of the things he said, which I had begun to realize myself, is he said, the difficult things that happen in our lives, that sometimes when we look back, it's not so easy when something is current and we're very upset. But I don't know if it's ever happened with you, that you might look back at something that happened maybe when you're a teenager or a student, and at the time you might have felt it was the end of the world. Maybe a
Mm.
relationship broke up, or maybe somebody cheated you of money, or whatever, some issue that felt really, really hard at the time. And now looking back, part of you may think, maybe this happened for a reason. Because when I look back, I learned a lot. Okay,
Mhm.
maybe I learned about myself. You're nodding, so I'm sure it's resonating with you. Or maybe I got a bit wiser. Or if it was a relationship broke up, and now I look back and I say, well, thank goodness it broke up.
We've all been
Right?
there.
We've all been there, all right? And so when we look back on things, sometimes it's easier to get that perspective that maybe these events happened for a reason. And as Colin said in that first time I listened to him, maybe these things happened to me. No, it didn't
Mm.
happen to me, they happened for me. And it's a completely different perspective. So the person who seemed to be my tormentor at that time could actually be seen in another way as having been a teacher,
Mm.
not consciously, not
Right.
consciously, all right? Because I was probably a teacher for them in a different way. But when we look back, we can see that. So that was one of the things he said, that things don't happen to us, they happen for us. And then the other aspect of what he talked about was he acknowledged that for many people, forgiveness is not easy.
Mm.
And one of the reasons I think that we can sometimes feel uncomfortable about forgiveness is that we think that if I forgive somebody for what they did, that I'm saying what they did was all right. I'm condoning their actions. And sometimes we might feel that that's weak or that we're letting them away with it. All right. And I think that can often be a stumbling block, that we feel if I forgive him, I'm saying that I don't mind what he does, that I'm going to be a doormat, or that I'm just brushing it under the carpet. Does that resonate for
It
you?
does.
Right. Yeah. So quite often we feel that forgiveness is a condoning of somebody's actions, and we'll talk about that. So that's, I think, one of the misgivings people can have, that it's kind of like almost a weakness to forgive somebody because they'll walk all over you the next time. So when we're talking about radical forgiveness, we're not saying about, it's not forgiving and forgetting. We can still remember, but what we're losing is the charge we feel. And I'll let you ask questions now in a minute, but I just wanted to give an example of somebody that I worked with. I was their coach, and he'd been involved in a very small business with friends. And then the business something went wrong, and somebody he thought his friend was also his boss, and the boss sacked him, or fired him, as you would say in America, suddenly. And there was a lot of bad feeling. And he found that whenever he lived quite near this man, and he used to find that any time he went near this man's house, he would actually do a detour to avoid passing the man's house, because he would feel his whole body getting uptight, his stomach in knots. And so that it was like, even though the situation was over in one way, it was still tormenting him, and it was affecting his own health. And we did forgiveness work, and it wasn't that we said what the person did was okay, but it kind of freed him from having it like a noose around his neck. And he actually found that one day he found himself passing this man's house before he'd even realized it. And he didn't feel anything, around it. So the charge had gone out of it for him. So if you've any questions on what I've said so far.
Right. Well, I just really an acknowledgement that when I started to sit down to write out the questions that I wanted to cover for our topic, I just had a realization that there is so much pain in my heart around this topic. And there's certainly some, I don't know, still some like old anger and things like that around certain topics. But mostly what it is really these like core painful feelings of life, just heartbreak, in particular sadness and a deep sense of loss that happens. And, I think both of us really want to hold space for people who are watching this, because, sometimes needing to forgive another person is as simple as two people having a misunderstanding. And just, clarifying that through additional conversation can help. But I look at over the years at friends who've shared situations, and has been way more complex than I've experienced. But it's just like needing to raise a child with someone who's dishonest, that you can't trust. So it's like there's times in life when, again, it's like it's two good people who've misunderstood each other, and it's just a beautiful process to come back and to have a beautiful dialogue, a healing dialogue between two people. But like what you have acknowledged already, there's times when, when we can't have that, where you can't reconcile and you also can't forgive or forget. We can forgive, but not forget. So I love, and it's funny because I wrote out, in big letters that this is a really complex topic. So I'm just glad that we have a guide, you, to help us through it. So.
Well, listen, if I'm a guide, I'm only a step or two ahead, because, nobody has this done perfectly. Like, we can still get triggered. And I think that keeps us human, and it keeps us humble. All right. Now, there are some people who may say that forgiveness is easy. It may be easy for them. But it's like anything. If we're naturally good at something, like, somebody might be very naturally gifted at music or art or athletics, and to them it seems easy, and they can find it hard then to understand how other people find it difficult. So just to reassure people that I think the majority of people do find this a challenging area. And when we're starting, I will introduce one of the processes to the group, because the great thing about radical forgiveness is not just that it presents us with some very, very good core understandings about forgiveness. But its real gift to me, at least, was that it provides tools, because we can talk forever about it. And actually, sometimes we could have a really lovely conversation about how wonderful forgiveness is, and then feel really high after the conversation. And then the next thing, we find something coming up and we don't know what to do about it. And we actually can feel worse about ourselves.
Yeah.
We should be able to forgive.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's just to acknowledge that it is a challenge, but it can be, there are processes and understandings that can help. And when we do the process, which I'm going to introduce in a little while, I would suggest that people in general would start with something that isn't a huge area for them. So maybe not their biggest nemesis. Right? You can start with small things, almost like you're building your muscle, okay, and get used to how it works. And then the really difficult ones, I mean, for most people, the deepest areas of forgiveness will be with parents and family, siblings, could be partners, it could be business partners. So they're often the biggest ones. It can be groups, but the family, really, you can think of it in one level as our families provide our greatest learning opportunities. So I know as a coach, most people who would come to me for coaching would be dealing with those issues around family and the deeper ones. But there's still a lot you can do on your own. And that's why I'd love your listeners to, especially as we're going to have a few conversations around this, that they feel that there are things they can do now themselves. And they can also check, but they can check my website, of course, and you'll put a link on that at the end of the talk, but also the Radical Forgiveness website. Simply radicalforgiveness.com, and it has a huge amount of free resources that you can use. Okay, so talking about that, just getting back to what you were talking about, the feelings that we can feel around it, the pain, the sorrow, the regret, the sadness, the grief we can feel. In Radical Forgiveness, we encourage people to feel those. And it doesn't mean that you have to be bearing your soul or crying your eyes out. Sometimes if it's a very deep one, yes. And you have full permission to do that, because we say that you can't heal what you don't feel. But you don't have to be, really, really upset. You can just even acknowledge to yourself that you're feeling these feelings. Because in our culture, depending on people's background, but particularly people who have grown in an environment where they're not encouraged to feel their feelings, and that can be male or female, but I do think a lot of men particularly have been brought up in that way. Big boys don't cry and all of that. So it can be harder, or if you've grown up in just a very repressed type of society. I mean, there are some cultures where people do express their feelings more openly, and where it's more acceptable to cry. For example, a lot of the Latin cultures, I think, are like that. Okay, whereas a lot of other cultures, the stiff upper lip that we associate maybe with the English culture, or the macho image, where we're not encouraged to feel our feelings. Or it can happen, and I'm sure there are people listening to this who have been in spiritual groups or maybe in New Age groups, which are wonderful, but there can be a bias against saying don't be negative, and people can be afraid to be negative. You've heard that. And you have to be happy, right? You have to be happy, 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 happy. And that kind of happiness is actually, Colin calls that a spiritual bypass, which is a very good expression, okay? Because it's actually suppressing the feelings, and they don't go away. They just get buried more deeply. And quite often they jump out and bite us in another way. Okay, so what's really lovely about Radical Forgiveness is that you have permission to be who you are. You have permission to acknowledge that you might be angry, or you might be vengeful even, or even feeling murderous. Because if you can admit that, you're much less likely to act on it. Right? If you can say to somebody, or even to yourself, yes, I'm very angry with my partner or with my mother or whoever it might be, the very fact of bringing that to the surface and allowing yourself to feel even some of the feelings, and in the process we're going to do in a moment, even allowing yourself to realize that you'll feel that somewhere in your body. You'll feel it if you tune in where that emotion is. You feel it in your stomach or your heart or your throat or somewhere. And just even that much, allowing yourself to feel that a little bit and be present to it, that's actually very healing. So we're allowed to feel our feelings and to be very, very human.
Well, I appreciate
Okay.
you saying that because I think it's funny because what I really had come up for me as I was preparing for all of this was all of the deep pain. And you brought up one, I think that's been the deepest pain is all of especially in the realm of law of attraction, is to not really be present with some of the feelings that don't feel great because we don't want to attract more of those. And for
Yes.
example, in my I do the morning pages and really am just, trying to
They're
get what's out
wonderful.
there. And a lot in the morning is like, I am really scared. I'm pushing myself to do some challenging things and taking a lot of risk in my life right now. And so, I would write out, I'm really scared right now. And then I'd be like, oh no, I'm not supposed to say that because this whole I am phrase is a big thing right now. And I'm supposed to be, I am powerful. I am. And so I've really been sitting with that about how disempowering it is to not just allow yourself to be where you're at because
Absolutely.
I personally believe that these feelings want to come up for healing. So if I can be present with them and move through them, then I can move naturally into those higher states. But I agree with you. Anytime I suppress those kinds of things, they usually pop up in other ways. And I just don't find it helpful. But
Yeah, they pop
yeah.
up in other ways, or even if they don't come up obviously where we recognize them, they come up in our body somewhere,
Mm.
or they come up as, in the environment around us. And actually, I mean, I've been listening an awful lot to a teacher that some of you may have heard of is Pema Chodron. She's a
Mm-hmm.
Buddhist teacher, and she talks a lot about in that tradition, they actually say that the way to know fearlessness is to know the nature of fear, that you smile at fear, that you allow yourself to feel it, because if you push it away, or any of the feelings that we consider to be negative in the
Mm-hmm.
sense of that, what you're saying in the context of something like the law of attraction, or in that those sort of contexts, sometimes anything that isn't blissful and smiling and happy can be kind of pushed aside,
Mm-hmm.
as if acknowledging them is negative, but actually in a funny kind of a way we're making them more powerful by denying them.
I agree.
We're giving them more power over us. And we're almost afraid to be afraid, which can actually compound the fear. Or, and there's nothing wrong with sadness and with anger and any of these feelings. Where they become dangerous is when they're denied.
Mm.
Okay, because they'll come out in ways that we don't mean. We'll snap at somebody, or we'll think we're not sad at all, but the next thing we're on our third vodka or whatever, or whatever the
Let's
drug
hope
of
not.
choice is, or binging on Netflix or whatever it might be. Okay, so with radical forgiveness, I mean, I might as well just introduce in this context. In the radical forgiveness, and I know Brenda mentioned this, it's a 5-step process,
Mm-hmm.
and all of the processes they go to different levels of intensity or depth. Okay, but they all contain 5 basic processes. And the first one, or 5 basic stages, and the first one is what we call telling your story. Because if you feel you need to forgive, at some level you do feel a victim energy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. That's not wrong. Okay. So if you feel something around somebody has hurt you, upset you, betrayed you, we can feel it against ourselves as well, then it's important to recognize that I do in this moment feel like a victim. Right? Even if the part of me that has studied all these wonderful spiritual books says there's no such thing.
Right,
Okay. All
right.
right. Okay. Let that part of our mind park for a little while, because if we want to kind of transmute, if you like, the victim story, we must allow ourselves to be in the victim story. It's like if you want to go from New York to San Francisco, well, you have to start in New York.
Mm-hmm.
Start where you are. Okay. So the first thing we do in any of the processes is tell our story. Now, in the process I'm going to do with you online just now, you just think in your own mind. You're reminding yourself of what it is. There's what's called a worksheet where you literally write it down and read it out loud to yourself. If you're coming to a coach, you would tell the coach, and that's very beneficial if it's very deep issues. Okay, sometimes being heard by somebody else. So in some way, you actually pinpoint what it is you want to forgive somebody for. Okay. And then the second stage, now for a lot of people, the second stage happens at the same time, and that's feeling the feelings. So for a lot of people, when they tell the story of how somebody broke off a relationship, or they felt that somebody cheated them of money, or somebody took their job, or any of those things. Now, when they tell that, a lot of people will feel emotional. So for some people, it isn't really necessary for them to think of feeling their feelings, but others find it harder. And what we do is just encourage you, say in the one that I'm going to read out loud, is just to tune into your body and see if you can feel the feeling somewhere in your body. And usually you can. Okay. So it's just acknowledging that along with the feeling of not being able to forgive, there's some kind of emotional charge. And in radical forgiveness, we see the richness in that charge. That's where the richness is. Okay. All right. It's not something to be afraid of. So that's the second stage. And I'm sure that would be comforting to people to realize that your feelings are not only tolerated, they are welcomed. Okay, because they give a richness. I mean, we're not just all positive beings. The fullness of life includes the light and the dark. All right. Or if you think of a piano, the piano includes the black and the white keys, or it includes the low notes and the high notes. And to be fully human in all its spectrum, and to have compassion for others and to be able to relate to others, then the more comfortable we are with the full spectrum of who we are, the more people will feel safe with us as well. So that's the first two stages. And then the third stage, and sometimes it sort of happens concurrently, but the third stage is what we call collapsing the story, which sounds quite a strong phrase to say. But quite often, and I've done this so often in my own life anyway, is where I might be holding some resentment of somebody, or feel hurt by what they did, or feel that they deliberately set out to harm me. Now, this is usually in the ordinary things, especially because most of our issues are with things that aren't like mega crimes. Okay, they're ordinary, everyday things. And then when you begin to realize, well, one of the things maybe the person may not have intended to hurt me in the way that I took them up. Quite often they don't. People are usually caught up on their own stuff, and they're not even conscious of their effect on me most of the time. Okay. So sometimes we are putting interpretation onto a situation, and it's that interpretation that's often making us suffer even more than what the person did. I'm sure that makes sense to you, does it?
Definitely.
Yeah, right. And it can often be the other way too. It's sometimes, and how I've learned this sometimes, is I find people blaming me for something and I had no intention.
Right.
Often happens between parents and children. Children blame parents for things. I can remember when my son was about 18 and he'd got over the thing that we were the worst parents in the world he's ever teenagers. And he said to me one day, he says, "Yeah, Mom, parents are great for blaming." And what he meant, blame your parents. Everything. So sometimes what we are resenting in other people is not intended. Okay. Sometimes too, even if the person was unkind or angry with us, or even lashed out at us or hit us, and if we think about it, we may realize, gosh, they were actually going through a very tough time, and they were at their wits' end. And so it's not saying that what they did was right, but we might begin to get a little compassion for where they were, or we may realize, what an awful family background they had. And again, it's not letting them off the hook. Say if it was a criminal act, we're not saying, "Oh, you poor thing, you had a bad childhood, so we'll forget what you did." But in a funny kind of a way, if somebody has done something even criminal to us, if we do a bit of forgiveness work around it, we can actually deal with it in a much calmer way, in a much more powerful way, than if we go in full of anger. All right. So the collapsing the story helps us to begin to see, maybe I am putting interpretation onto this that isn't fully accurate. And another thing we might see is that we may have a pattern around this particular issue. And sometimes that's easier to see in other people. We can all be experts on other people's lives, if you notice that. Okay. So much easier, right? You can see what they're doing. And, so sometimes you might see, for example, a friend who seems to have the same relationship, but with a different person, right? Same issues come up, right? Or indeed, it could happen to ourselves as well, right? So we can sometimes repeat the same dynamics in a relationship, but the face changes. Okay. And at a certain point, when we come to a point, and often people come to radical forgiveness when they're ready to see this, and they begin to realize, okay, well, I'm really mad at this person, this man, for doing what he did. And then I look back and I said, but it was the same thing with him and him and him. Maybe it's something in me. All right. Okay. And that's not an easy thing to realize. And sometimes that's why self-forgiveness comes in as well. But when we begin to realize that, then it begins to take some of the charge out of focusing on him, and we begin to see maybe some of the patterns are in me. Okay. All right. So the collapsing the story begins to sift out what's really true in what happened and what are the interpretations, the patterns that make us suffer. Because, again, in the Buddhist tradition, they say that pain is inevitable in life, but suffering is, in a sense, we cause a lot of our own suffering by the way we approach and interpret. Okay, so in this third stage, we do that. The fourth stage is what's called a reframe. And what that is, and in the process I'm going to do with you, it's a very simple one. It's like even beginning to acknowledge that what the person did, it was done for me rather than to me. Or we might begin to realize maybe I learned something from it. Maybe it was part of a bigger picture, that kind of thing. Okay. Now, sometimes when if you work with the tools on a more regular basis, you may begin to see what that person is mirroring for you and teaching you. So if it were, for example, that, say in relationships, that even, that the same type of dynamic happens, that the person seems to maybe somebody is always in a relationship with somebody they can't trust around money, or somebody who, maybe it won't pay their share and they expect the other person to be the breadwinner, okay, or whatever. It could be something like that, or it could be somebody who doesn't do, or maybe somebody who's unfaithful all the time, or whatever the issue might be. And so if you look at a relationship and you see you've got a string of those relationships, and you may then begin to realize that, God, these people are telling me, maybe they're showing me that I don't respect myself enough to feel that I deserve a good relationship. All right. Maybe they're showing me where I don't love myself and honor myself, or where maybe they're showing me where I need to be able to be a little bit more assertive. Okay. Or whatever it might be. Okay. So you begin to get a sense that this person, from the level of, I don't know if you're comfortable with the idea of having maybe a higher self, or soul, or Colin uses a very nice expression. He says we have spiritual intelligence. So we don't just have emotional intelligence or our IQ, like our mental intelligence, but we all have spiritual intelligence. And we can sense that even if we don't feel we're spiritual people, we often have intuition or hunches. We have a hunch about something, or an inner voice. So whatever that means to you. But on that level, that part of us may see the situation as actually a really important and valuable experience for us, as a way of learning and exploring and coming into greater power. So in the one we're going to do now, people may or may not get that insight as quickly, but by doing the processes, which I will introduce over the next few weeks, they may begin to. And then quite often what happens, doesn't have to, but you might actually begin to feel grateful to the person. Okay. For actually being willing to play that role for you. Right. You don't have to feel it, but quite often you do. All right. Feel a bit grateful that person was, in a sense, if you think of it like a drama or a film, they were willing to be the bad guy. Okay. Right. In my movie. Okay. And like a movie or a play is as good as its bad guy, in a sense, isn't it? Like it's a bit boring if they're all good. So I hope that makes sense. And then the final stage, and then you can ask me any questions. The final stage actually goes through all of it. It's what's called integration. Because again, as I said early when we begin the conversation, it's very easy to talk pretty. It's very easy to sound philosophical. What's really important is integration. And in radical forgiveness, we do something physical to integrate what we've done. So it can be using our voice, which is the one I'll be talking you through. With the worksheets, it's actually writing and then reading out what you've written. Sometimes we use art, whatever. Okay, so it's doing something physical so that what we're doing gets anchored in the physical body. And in that way, it's much more long lasting and it's much more real. So they're the 5 stages. And no matter whether there's a really short process, which I'll share in our third conversation, the one I'm going to do with you shortly, or any of the longer processes, they all include those 5 stages. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's just an overview. So if you have any questions on what I've said.
First I'd like to step into the process just to keep things in order. And then, I definitely have some questions after.
Yeah,
so.
I think that would be really good, because it's like, I don't know if you have this expression in America, but here we say the proof of the pudding is in the eating. You have that expression?
I don't think that I've heard something similar, but that's not the exact way. So
like
the proof is in the pudding, I think is what I've heard. But
yes, similar. It's when you eat it, when you taste it, when you experience it, is where you really get the feeling for what the thing is. And if that's why I feel it's very valuable for people to experience one of the processes, because if they feel something from it, then they might realize they'd like to explore further. And you don't have to feel like a whole, revolution or what's the word, epiphany, but you may just feel even a slight shift around the situation. And even that much is enough maybe to make people feel this is something that may help me. Okay. Now, what this process is called the 13-step process, and I will actually read it. And in it, I will talk through these steps. The first one is just to ask you in your own mind, and people can do this. Now, if people are skeptical, they can just listen now and then they'll be able to replay the video anytime. Okay. But you're just in your own mind, and I'll give people a few moments to think of something that they'd like to forgive. And ideally, I think for the first one, not a major trauma. Okay. If that's what comes to mind, okay. But it could be something very small, but just something where you feel a charge. So you just remind yourself of that. Then I will ask you to just close your eyes then, and you don't have to, but you're welcome to if you want to.
Oh, I would love
and then
to.
Just place your hands somewhere where you feel that in your body. And very likely you will. And I will say to people, if tears come, let them come. Now, normally it isn't bawling your eyes out, but you might feel your eyes getting a little bit, I was going to say misty. Excuse the pun. Okay.
No pun intended. Or pun.
Okay. And then, so we just allow ourselves to feel the feelings. And then I will ask a series of questions. And you're asked to say yes for the questions. And that's using your voice. Even if you're skeptical, it's useful to say yes. Now, you don't have to, but I will just make it obvious when I'm asking a question. At the end of it, I'll raise my voice a little bit so that people will know that I've asked the question. And then I'll say the word yes so that they know what we're doing. So the questions will bring people through these stages. And then at the end, we'll just spend a few moments quietly. Now, just one thing I want to clarify, because in one of the questions it says, can you allow the situation to be perfect just the way it is? Now, we're not saying it's perfect on a human level. All right. If the guy jilted you, or if somebody stole money from you, or somebody was rude to you, or whatever it might be, that isn't perfect on a human level. We're talking from the perspective of our spiritual intelligence. Maybe that's just the thing that we needed. From the perspective of the part of us that's the director of the movie, okay, that's actually directing events. So from that perspective, it may have been necessary. So that's what we meant by perfect. So we're not saying the behavior on a moral or human level was perfect. Okay. So we ready? Ready to roll? Okay. And I think this will, I love sharing this with people. I do it when I give talks all the time, because I think it really helps people to see what this is about. Okay. So in your own mind, you tell the story or go over as you see it in a concise way as possible, allowing the feelings associated with this story to come to the surface. So I'll just give everybody a few moments to do this. And as you go ahead and close your eyes, if you haven't already, you might become aware of the place in your body where the emotions seem to be located. And put your hand on that place if you can. And if it's somewhere you can't reach, like your back, you can just put your attention on it. And that's fine. And just take a moment and let the feelings come up to be expressed if they need to. Don't judge them or resist them. And we'll just take about 20 seconds just to feel the feelings. And we'll go on now. So even if you don't understand how or why, are you willing to be open to the possibility that the situation may be purposeful and that your higher self has created the situation for your spiritual growth?
Yes.
Yes. Do you realize that your upset is a direct reflection of something that needs to be healed? And that even if you cannot see it yet, the healing message is contained in the situation? Yes.
Yes.
Are you willing to release your need to judge the situation as right or wrong, good or bad? Yes.
Yes.
Even if you cannot explain how or why, can you simply allow the situation to be perfect just the way it is? Yes.
Yes.
Can you be open to the idea that you only get upset when someone resonates in you something about you that you have denied, repressed, and projected onto them, and that what is upsetting you about the other person represents a part of you that is crying out to be loved and accepted? Yes.
Yes.
Even if you have no idea what that part of you is that you have disowned, are you willing to unconditionally love and accept that part of you right now, in this moment? Yes.
Yes.
Perhaps you can feel your heart opening now to that part of you that you have rejected. If so, welcome it back. Embrace it. And love it unconditionally right now. Now we'll just take some more time for this. That's feeling your heart opening now to that part of you that you have rejected. And if there are others involved, are you willing to be open to the idea that you attracted them into your life and that subconsciously you are both receiving exactly what you have both needed, enabling each of you to let go of your addiction to being a victim so you can reconnect with your true nature and access the power within you? Yes.
Yes.
Do you recognize that in forgiving them, you have forgiven yourself? Yes.
Yes.
Let me know when the feelings you had at the beginning have begun to subside. Nod your head yes to confirm that this has happened and that you are now beginning to feel the divine love behind the apparent situation. Nod your head yes when the story that was attached to those feelings has lost some or most of its charge. Or maybe you can't even hardly remember what it was. Lovely. Forgiveness being always a change in perception and a shift in energy. You may now begin to feel this occurring within you. Notice any sensations in your body that confirm that this is happening. It is through taking your attention away from the story you had previously given your power to, and focusing instead on the truth, that the release occurs. Nod your head yes as you feel this happening, and as you connect to the truth of who you are. And so we just take a few moments with the eyes closed, and when you're ready, you can simply open your eyes. Right, so.
So it's interesting, what came up for me during that process was that I generally feel in really complex situations, there's different types of emotions going on. There is that genre of emotions that make us feel like a victim, so we can feel frustration, anger, upsets, anxiety, depression, any of those. And then I also just feel these like more heart-centered emotions of like really just deep sadness. And what came up for me in particular was a thing that I noticed that I wasn't giving myself, that I was hoping the other person would, was to just be myself.
Yeah.
So it's interesting because the reality is that we can't control the other person. I mean, we can share what our needs are, and in this situation, I was not able to communicate that. But I don't think in the situation that I worked on, the other person would have been able to give me that. And so, of course, I'm just thinking that in my head. I don't know because I didn't try, but even that brings on a level of sadness.
Of course.
Because there's lots of times when I've looked to get some sort of support from another person in a difficult situation, and for whatever reason, that person wasn't able to support me. And sometimes they just don't know what to say. Like I was just reading a book last week called The Art of Comforting. And it was literally a book trying to help people be able to really help people who've gone through a difficult situation, like a painful loss or maybe a sickness or something. And what was admitted in that book is something I think we can all feel so strongly, is that sometimes when people try to comfort us, they do it in a way that actually makes you in more pain. And
Absolutely.
so that's just something that came up for me, as like, it's one thing for me to realize and sit with the realization, but I think a deeper sadness that surfaces for me is that I'm never going to be able to get this need met with this person. So
Right.
yeah.
Like, that can be hard. It can be hard. Yeah. And just love and accept that for yourself. Like it, I mean, it's not that there's anything wrong with you for wanting that to be the case. It's quite touching. And even what you said about comforting others, I mean, I feel that this kind of work, I mean, even the fact that you can look at that sadness and admit it very bravely on video, allows other people to look at that sadness and feel okay about maybe feeling a similar sadness. And, I think that humanizes us more. And also, even in terms of you saying being able to be of comfort to people who are going through difficult times, I really feel that it's to the extent that we are accepting of the full spectrum of our own lives and our own grief. Because if we are afraid of grief or we've glossed it over, then it's very hard to be in the presence of somebody who's grieving, because it brings it up and we can't handle it. And then quite often, and I'm speaking from my own experience, both at the receiving and giving end, both trying to be busy and also, as you say, sometimes people, they're doing their best,
Right.
but you actually feel as if they're trying to stop you feeling because they can't handle it.
Exactly.
It's not that they don't love you. So, I think the more we can, accept the full spectrum, and that this sadness and this grief is as much part of being human as the happy times. And in a weird way, when we accept that they don't hurt as much, if that makes sense to you,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah,
It's
I
when we.
definitely feel these core painful feelings are the ones that are very difficult to sit with.
Mm-hmm.
And so the tendency then would be to look outside of me, to blame.
Of course.
Because the feelings of anger and resentment, those feel sometimes more powerful than
Yeah.
than really sitting with these deeper emotions.
Absolutely. And you're very, it's very self-aware for you to even realize that. Okay. So to give yourself credit for that. It is easier, even though it's not easy to feel resentment or something to somebody else. Okay. It's not easy. It doesn't feel good. Okay. But it is in a way easier than actually allowing ourselves to feel our own vulnerability and our own sensitivities, to be willing to sort of sit with those for a while. It's much easier to sort of try to distract ourselves in some way or another. Okay. And that's why even in radical forgiveness, we generally encourage people to start with forgiveness of others, because even though people think that's not easy, I honestly think anytime I've been speaking to live groups and I say, how many of you find it easier? How many of you find it easier to forgive other people? Well, it's something like, do you find it easier to forgive others than yourself? Okay. And nearly everybody finds that easier. We can really be hard on ourselves. And I think you've said that, you have that as well.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, if it's time, I'd like to launch into a particular question around that topic.
Of course.
I
Yeah.
shared with you via email, but I'll share with our audience that,
Yes.
it's something that Brenda Reese said. So she's another radical forgiveness coach, for those listening, who did some other videos with me, video conversations. And she
Yes.
mentioned
Yeah.
that it's, like you just said, it's easier to forgive other people than it is to forgive yourself. And I remember sitting with that because at some level that feels logical to my mind. But the reality is that I feel that I have somehow created or absorbed a behavior pattern where when conflict happens with another person, I'm always turning that back on myself. Analyzing everything that went wrong, making it my faults, wanting to
Yes.
change what I did so that I can affect how the other person behaved toward me. And
Yeah.
again, I logically know that that's, not helpful and
Yeah.
most likely impossible, because that's me wanting to try to control the other person. So yeah, I was just kind of curious, like from a radical forgiveness perspective, like what's up with that behavior pattern? Because I think when I talk to people, most people tend to blame anger and upset outside of them, and I tend to direct that inside toward myself. And I'm sure lots of people do, but so I'm just
Yeah.
curious, like,
It's
what's the
very, very,
deal?
I think it's more common than people admit,
Okay.
okay, to internalize a lot of the issues. And then what that can also, do is have us take responsibility for things that aren't our responsibility. Often happens in families, okay, where we feel guilty because of what's going on between our parents. Children can feel that. The parents are arguing. They feel it must be something they did. All of that kind of thing. So, and we are in a culture, and it's interesting that I've heard some of the Buddhist teachers saying that in the East, that we have a culture in the West of almost like a self-loathing or a lack of self-love. With all our or all our showing off and presenting ourselves and all of that, there's often a core lack of self-worth. That's not self-esteem in a superficial way. And I remember hearing that apparently the Dalai Lama, I'm sure most people have heard of the Dalai Lama, was giving a talk somewhere where there were an awful lot of very, very knowledgeable and experienced Western Buddhist and meditation teachers. And it came up at some point that somebody asked him how to handle what this sort of the way we turn things in ourselves, the way we don't respect ourselves, the way we dislike ourselves often, which is at the core of some of what you're saying, I think. And he couldn't understand it. He says, hate yourself, what is this? And it
What
had
a
to be
beautiful
translated for
perspective
him.
to not understand that.
Yeah. And so in their culture, that kind of not that self-denigration that we have, that we try to compensate for by being good at things and all of that, it just doesn't exist in the Eastern culture in the same way, apparently. So a lot of us have this. And then, so it's natural enough then to turn things in ourselves, and to blame ourselves for what other people do. And then, as you say, sometimes then thinking that if we change, then the other person might behave the way we want them to. Like, so we're playing these sort of energetic dances that are unspoken, but they're very real, and they lead to all sorts of mixed messages that go on. And as you realize, like, nobody can fulfill certain things for us, no matter how, no matter how hard we try to make them. And often, if we try to make them, they're going to pull away, because it's, in a sense, on some level, they know it's not their responsibility. I mean, how I've learned that, again, is the other way around. If somebody wants me to fulfill them in ways that I just can't, then, sometimes you just have to pull back a bit, So with the self-forgiveness, one of the things we do, and that's why I felt it would be good to do our next conversation on self-forgiveness, is begin to distinguish a little bit, for example, between shame and guilt, because we often confuse those two. And then even with guilt, and we will talk about this again next week, but I think because you brought it up, it's valuable to distinguish between what might be called appropriate guilt and inappropriate guilt. I mean, there is such a thing as there's a healthy guilt, which is basically remorse, okay, regret. Okay, so if I do something that really damages somebody, then it's a healthy thing to feel a certain regret. I mean, I would actually need to be made of stone not to feel something if I've hurt somebody. But if I feel guilty about something that was really outside my control, then it's a bit like what you're saying there. I'm appropriating responsibility that isn't actually my responsibility. Okay? And that's what, I mean, an example Colin gives is that, say if you're at a party and you, not you, I say somebody, not you, I'm not pretending that you would drink a lot, I don't know, but say it's me, okay? I go to a
I
party
do drink a lot of
all right,
water.
okay, very serious, that's a serious problem, okay? So I go to a party and I drink anything that I can get my hands on, okay? Which I don't, but if I did. And then I'm driving home and I knock somebody down and I injure them or kill them, okay? Now, obviously, there's an appropriate guilt, okay, in the sense of remorse. It's appropriate for me to feel bad about what happened, okay, and to want to either make amends or to do something, okay. Now, but if I am the one at the party, like you, drinking water, I'm absolutely clear, and then I'm driving home and somebody who is drunk comes in front of the car before I can see them, and again, they're badly injured or killed. Now, I can feel bad about it, of course, but it's not really appropriate for me to feel guilty, because it wasn't any of my actions that led to that happening. And this sort of guilt can very strongly happen in families. And again, we can go through this next week. But if, for example, if our parent, say if a child is sensitive, and I think a lot of people listening to this video, by the very nature of your course, okay, by the very nature of what you're doing, most of us interested in spiritual growth and personal development growth, we are sensitive in some way or another. We have a wish to good. We want to serve in the world. We want to make a difference in the world. I think that would very, very likely fit the profile of your listeners. Okay, we know that by our actions and by who we become, we contribute, or if we don't change, we don't contribute, right? So we know that. And so we can have the will to serve is very, very valuable, but it can get confused with being a rescuer. All right. And there can be an unhealthy aspect of the rescuer that tries to rescue everybody. And a child can get into that. So if the parents are unhappy, the child may feel that maybe it's something that they did, or they weren't a good girl, so daddy is mad with mommy, or if daddy leaves. So particularly if a child, say, has a temper tantrum one day and is just in bad form, and the next day daddy leaves. Now the child can interpret that daddy left because I was a bad girl. Daddy may have left because the parents weren't getting on. He may have had to go to work. He may have had to go to war. Goodness knows. Okay. But the child can take on guilt. That's her interpretation, her misinterpretation, because she's so young, and she can carry that type of guilt. And then if her mother is unhappy, she may also feel a guilt around that. Okay, so that's just a very common type dynamic. So we'll look at that next week, and that's why I think this session will lead very well into that.
That's
okay,
great.
So I hope that helps.
Yes.
Yes.
So Rose, I just want to wrap up by having you share a little bit about how people can reach out to you if they're interested in getting to know more about you or working with you.
They're very welcome. I have a website which I need to update a little bit more, but I'll do that. Technology isn't my forte. But they can get in touch with me. If obviously people living in Ireland, if there's anybody, I can do coaching here, and I occasionally do workshops in Dublin. We could also, radical forgiveness coaching works very, very well on Skype. I've done it with people from several countries. So you can get in touch with me. But I also want to say that there's a lot you can do for yourself. All right. But the value in when the coaching can be very helpful is if it's very deep issues and you really feel you need help with we have some deeper processes that we can go through. And sometimes it can just help to kind of tease things out, or to get a different perspective, or feel you have permission to admit certain feelings. So people can get in touch with me through my website, and you'll have all those details on definitely. The thing. And so they're very welcome to get in touch or to become a contact on Facebook. I'm on Facebook as well, and we can take it from there. Okay.
Sounds great. And I want to share with you before we close, and for everybody watching, that Rose has her About page is really lovely. And I really appreciated what you said about, in fact, you just used the word the dance between wanting to be this spiritual, connected, like really connected within and above, and then also needing to manage living in the real world. And so that dance between, having a balance between the two of those things is something you mentioned, and I really relate to that. So I definitely look forward to chatting with you next week. And for everybody watching, we're actually going to be doing Forgiving Yourself next week, and then we'll do a third call, and that will be on forgiving life circumstances, because as you know, we've all been born into certain situations that can be really challenging. And I think the thing that I'm really falling in love with this whole radical forgiveness concept, especially when you say, instead of I'm just thinking of like a life circumstance, it might be really hard if somebody's born with a handicap or born into an impoverished family. And it's just great to think that at some level that these kinds of things are happening for us and not to us. And when we're able to shift our perspective in that way, I think really powerful things happen. So such a beautiful process. And I'm so glad that you're here to share it with us, Rose.
You're most welcome. And it's been an absolute joy. And I'll just say as a kind of an adjunct to what you said there, it isn't even just that we can see a different perspective, but our feeling around it changes. Because it's in our feelings, it's in our emotional, in our gut almost, that we begin to feel the difference as well, which is really, really powerful. So I look forward to next week's conversation, Misty. Awesome. And thank you for the opportunity as well.
All right, everyone, I want to encourage you to sign up for my monthly newsletter. It's called The Love Letter. And I invite all of my community to join me in these challenges, and you'll get emails as we go through the challenge, so you get a chance to join Rose and other people as they share their wisdom with us. As always, I'm so glad that you're here, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
All right.